with us today. All right, and there's Shannon. Oh, they've gone to Oh, so you did Christmas already. Wow. Hey, sir.
She's changed him. She does. We're in Jordan.
If it goes in reverse, yes. I'm not. Someone told me that there's a
Next
point where
Christmas too. Oh my
years away.
Oh yeah, thanks. Totally. Yeah. Well, we did that at birthday time this year because they were in Wilshire. I got birthday September, October. Yeah, but yes. But I'll get it all together.
I said all the cool kids are born on Christmas.
September. Two days.
Jesus.
That's like
Okay, good morning, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. We're spread out all over the. Say what? I know it was Friday.
Friday.
It just happened.
It did just happen.
Okay, I don't know if we can bring this. There's not many of us today, but we're chatty.
That's right.
And that's good. We're glad to have Jerry and Nikki Bell back with us from the Carolinas. Yeah, very good.
Good to see you.
All right, so I got the sense last week that y'all didn't like the Christmas carols we talked about. So I'm trying to do better today.
What was last week?
Oh, I didn't remember.
Well, the holly and ivy.
I liked it.
A Christmas tree.
Oh, Christmas tree's good.
Right. Okay. The reminder, next week we don't have Sunday school.
Yes.
One service, 10 o'clock, fellowship time 9:30 to 10 in James Gallery. All right? And come in, welcome, but just pick any seat. You know.
It looked preserved.
Yeah. This is our low attendance Sunday, but we set up as if with anticipation, as though everyone's going to be here today.
Quality rather than quantity.
Yeah, we got quality. Absolutely. Jim, glad you're back with us.
Good to be back.
Too. Okay. So we've been working through the stories behind some Christmas carols, and then when we come back in January, I've got a 4-week run. I'm going to sort of test run with you guys some lessons I've written for Smith and Helwis on creation. It's a different take on creation, looking at the title of the unit is Our Loving Creating God, and it's drawn from 4 different places in the Bible. So it's something a little bit different for us, looking at redemption in creation. So it's a little more theological, but it's also biblical, but not in a Bible book study way as well. Today I want to begin, we're going to try to hit several Christmas carols that I think will be more rewarding for you if you don't like nature.
Oh my goodness.
This last week, right, okay. Today I want to begin by talking about the carol, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. And you may know some of this story already. Does anyone off the top of your head know who wrote the words to I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day? Longfellow. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who was in his era America's greatest poet. He's been gone roughly 120 years or so, and still, well known in literature. Here's something he wrote elsewhere. Believe me, every man has his secret sorrows, which the world knows not, and oftentimes we call a man cold when he is only sad. May I say that again?
Yeah.
Sure. Every man has his secret sorrows, which the world knows not, and oftentimes we call a man cold when he is only sad. this is the origin of this carol. I heard the bells on Christmas Day. Yes?
Can I just interrupt for a minute? There was a great program on last week. It was called something like A Christmas Card from FX. And it was a Christmas carol. And it was in the correct time period and all that stuff, but it starred Guy Pearce as Scrooge. And it was a whole new take
Ah,
with the same events on A Christmas Carol. And what it got down to was Scrooge was the way he was because of a very old pain.
that is true to the story.
And you
Yeah,
found out what that was
yeah.
toward the end of the story.
Go see A Christmas Carol at Dallas Theater Center and you'll see that too. Yeah. That's the often forgotten part. There's a backstory to Scrooge. Yeah. So Longfellow was born in 1807. He was born in Portland, Maine, and he went to school at age 3. By 6, he was reading classical literature and writing stories. At 19, he was a college graduate. And he began at 19 as a professor of modern language. And I'm not sure how you pronounce this in English. It's Bowdoin. Bowdoin? Bowdoin College, right? So he taught and then he traveled in Europe. By age 22, he was writing his own textbooks. In 1831, he married, and by 1834, he was already considered one of the country's most respected scholars. So it was no surprise when Harvard University wooed him away, and he and his wife and their reputation moved off to Harvard, and they lived in a very fine house overlooking the Charles River, and yet within a year of moving to Massachusetts, his wife became ill and died. As a way to deal with his grief, he poured himself into teaching. It took 7 years before he recovered enough to be able to remarry. And in those days, it would be very common for a widower to remarry more quickly than that, right? So life began to resume, and then he and his second wife welcomed 5 children into their home. 5 kids. And during this period of happiness is when Longfellow wrote many of his classic poems, Evangeline, The Song of Hiawatha, The Courtship of Miles Standish. And by 1860, he was wealthy and famous around the world. And at that very moment, when he should have been basking in his success, tragedy struck his family again. He had been invited to Windsor Castle by Queen Victoria in 1861, and in that year, while lighting a match, Longfellow's second wife caught her clothes on fire and burned to death. And then came the American Civil War that tore him apart. He hated the Civil War. Every part of his being was offended by the Civil War. His family had been a founding family in America, deep roots in New England. And to see the country divided over such an issue was most difficult. By this point, his 19-year-old son, his oldest, whose name was Charles, was sent into battle for the Union and was wounded in battle, not killed, but wounded, and this turned Longfellow's discontent into just an outright rage. As he saw his son's injuries, and he saw other wounded soldiers on Cambridge's streets, as he talked with families who had lost their sons in battle, he asked his friends and he asked God, where is the peace? And then he took his pen in hand and wrote these lyrics that we know today. It was probably the ringing of Christmas bells that inspired the cadence of this that he wrote on December 25th, 1863. That day, he hung his whole message on the tolling of the church bells. Now, what we don't know, or what most of us are not aware of, is that there are originally 7 stanzas to I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. There's 2 of them that got dropped that we don't sing anymore. Those 2 verses I'm going to read to you because they're specifically about the Civil War. So we're familiar with I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. They're old familiar carols play. Wild and sweet, the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. What he's doing is setting you up with a bit of cheer because he's going to knock you back down, right? I thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled along the unbroken song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. We know that one. And in despair I bowed my head, there is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. We know that verse, but it's written specifically about the Civil War. Here are the 2 verses you don't know. Then from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men. You can see why those probably didn't make it. But this is what motivated Longfellow in writing this. And it's from that low point that he then goes on to bring us back up in the lyrics you know so well. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep, God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. So this is a Christmas carol born not only out of the Civil War and the depths of depression that created, but also out of his own personal sense of tragedy in his family. 2 of his 2 wives dying tragically, son wounded in the Civil War, which he hated and wished his son were not in. I think we can identify in different ways with this message. And it was the ringing of the bells, the church bells, on Christmas Day that sort of brought to mind this message that God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail. And isn't that what we really hope for in Christmas, is that in God's coming to us, there is redemption. There is this possibility that the things that are so unjust that we see today, God in time will set to right. Isn't that our hope in Christmas? Yeah. Comments on this carol, your observations of it? It's not like a deep theological text. It's not like others that are quoting scripture so much, although that line, God does not sleep, is certainly from the Psalms. He who neither slumbers nor sleeps.
Do you know when they dropped those 2 more negative verses or stanzas?
I did read that, and I can't remember the answer to that. Let's see if it's here.
I was just thinking, was it World War I, World War, when did they?
Was it ever even incorporated into the song, is what I'm wondering.
Yeah, initially it was.
Well, it's just so time specific, it would lose its meaning over time.
Oh, wait a minute, there's more. I got so wound up with that. Okay. 10 years after he wrote it, he wrote it as a poem, it was not a song. It was just a poem. And there was an Englishman named John Baptiste Culkin who put some music to it. He was an organist and music teacher, And he wrote this melody that we know specifically to go with this, not only to convey the bleak imagery of the sadness, but also the faith and the exhilaration. So this is not like a other carol that maybe has a meter that can be sung to different tunes. Once this music was put to the lyric, it became an instant hit, both in Europe and in the United States. And the author I'm reading says, except for the deletion of the 2 verses that dwelled on the poet's view of the Civil War, the song remains the same today as it was when it was first published. So I think the answer to the question is that when it was set to music, those 2 verses probably didn't make the music.
Okay.
Yeah. Recorded many, many times, as you know, and has brought hope to people during other times of war as well. Very popular in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam.
Do you have those 2 verses? And you may have read them,
I've got them right here.
but could you read them again?
Yeah. Then from each black accursed mouth the cannon thundered in the south, and with the sound the carols drowned of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent and made forlorn the households born of peace on earth, goodwill to men.
Does it indicate why they, probably the people who put music to it, eliminated those 2?
So my hunch is, it does not say, but I'm going to guess, it didn't translate into Europe, where it became very popular, and there probably came a time when the specificity of it was not as meaningful
Over there, is it?
over there, and even over here, sadly, over here, because go 10 years after the Civil War, and you get up into this time and think about what's happening after Lincoln's assassination. And by the way, have I recommended to you guys the 1865 podcast? All right, if you listen to podcasts, you gotta go look this up.
I had no idea they had podcasts in 1860.
No, it's amazing. It's time travel. 1865, the podcast, is produced by some local folks here. Stephen Walters is with the Dallas Theater Center, and David Archula met at Baylor University in the theater department. They were assigned a project to come up with, to write a paper about theater in the 19th century. Got to researching it, discovered there was no good theater in the 19th century. It was all vaudeville. So they went to the professor at Baylor and said, could we write a play instead, out of the 19th century? And the professor said yes, and they began writing a play about John Wilkes Booth and researching the whole thing. And out of that, they kept going. They discovered Booth was not the story. The story is Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War in Lincoln's cabinet and was held on after the assassination by Andrew Johnson, who was an incompetent drunk and a fool, by all standards. And Stanton grabbed the reins of power, but was very much for giving land to those former slaves and so forth, and Johnson, in time, took all that away. Johnson issued a blanket pardon of the Confederates. This podcast goes from the day of Lincoln's assassination forward, and it is extremely contemporary in its application. There's, I think, 15 episodes. If you listen to podcasts, go listen to that. This will resonate with that. Okay, Catherine.
Wasn't Johnson the one of the ones impeached?
Yes.
Yeah. I go,
Yeah, he was
what
acquitted of
interesting
sin by one vote.
parallels. And I'm sorry, I was late doing my duty.
Good for you.
Was the poet Longfellow? Well, he was from the north,
Yeah,
right?
from New England.
Yeah. Okay, because Just an interesting tidbit. We were in Atlanta recently, and in Atlanta, they have the Atlanta History Museum that includes a cyclorama of the
Yes, I've
Battle
been there.
of Atlanta, which is well worth the trip. But we learned some interesting history. That was actually painted in Wisconsin, and it showed the Union soldiers winning the Battle of Atlanta, which they did, but it was touring around, and when they brought it to Atlanta, it's like, they're not gonna buy this. So they repainted the uniforms of the Confederate soldiers as if they were the ones winning the battle. So, again, I was just.
Yeah, it's in a round building, and you sort of go around it. What happened to the tray of cookies I brought in? Would y'all open those and pass them around? Yeah, I meant for that to be there. Kathy?
The first verse you read
Yes.
just a minute ago.
Yes.
Does it say something about black mouth?
It says, from each black accursed mouth.
That's
Say
the
that
cannon
again.
mouth, right?
Yeah, he's talking about cannons.
Yeah, but
Then from each black accursed mouth, the cannon thundered in the south. So it's not referring to black people, it's referring to black cannons.
okay.
Yeah,
I knew it said cannon.
right. I think were he writing that today, he maybe be more sensitive to his language that would be misunderstood, right?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Black wasn't a common term for African Americans at the time either, so is that correct? Wouldn't it have
that's
been-
true. Yeah, that is true. Okay, I've got to see if I have, no, that's the wrong thing. How do I get to my bookmarks?
With Longfellow being that accomplished, is that what he's most known for? Is that Christmas Carol?
Well, I mean, many of his other poems are really well known and taught in school still. So, yeah. All right. Changing books here now.
Okay. You mean changing songs?
No, I'm changing songs. You want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, it just, can't you, I haven't heard it, it sounds so much similar to today, and I'm sure it is every decade. Since then, I'm sure people have felt that way, but, you know, the words, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men, and you feel that way today, even with all the political strife, and you get on Facebook and you got to get out your first aid kit to, you know, people are just so
Yeah, I'm
upset.
telling you, it's relevant, isn't it?
I mean, if nothing else, get on the news. And
Hate is strong and mocks the song.
yeah,
Yeah, think about that.
and then again, you also look at, well, gee, the
Thank-
whole
thank
point
you.
of we're in despair, but we're looking for hope. It's following the whole point of religion in culture is we're in despair and we're looking for faith, hope, and some sort of a reconciliation.
So here, Jim, you're right to the heart of the problem we live in today, and that is, for Christians, where is the hope to be found? And some of our brothers and sisters want to find hope in political power. And that is a fool's errand that will not get you anywhere. History shows that. And yet, that's where we have been living in my lifetime. And we're seeing the fulfillment of that in certain ways. Others want to find hope in the pie in the sky by and by, you know, somewhere in the afterlife. And the present doesn't matter because it's just suffering we got to go through. And that also gets you in trouble. So how do we find a faith that's relevant to today while also acknowledging that, and this is one of the things I like about this carol, that there can be peace. There's hope in there that there can be peace on earth, not just in heaven. But it also acknowledges that we as humans are responsible for not peace on earth. Right? So I don't quote Tom Wright nearly as much as I used to.
Way off.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of mad at him.
Oh, that's right. I remember that.
Yeah, I've moved on. But one thing that he consistently writes about redemption and about God's work in the world, is that God is setting the world to rights. And that's a British kind of phrase, but I like that what God is up to in the world is setting things right. And this carol, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day, really gets there. Now, this is a good segue to go to our next carol, which is O Come All You Faithful. Adeste Fidelis in the original on this. Yes. So, June 28th, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, and Germany ultimately ends up meeting enemies on two fronts. This is the beginning of World War I. I won't rehearse the whole history of that, except that the French, Belgian, and British forces couldn't stop the Russian forces, and these competing countries were on a strong offensive in France, and they dug in for a long winter. There were trenches dug just a few hundred feet apart from each other. Now, again, World War I was one of the bloodiest wars in history because the technology was so primitive and the conditions were awful.
And the soldiers were incredibly young.
And incompetent.
Yeah.
Yes, had no training to speak of. And talk about a ragtag band. You go read the history of World War I, and it would just stupefy you how this came to be. So they had these trenches. I mean, this was person-to-person combat, essentially. The trenches were dug a few hundred feet apart, and the soldiers spent most of the day dealing with mud and cold, and their guns were jammed often, and there was illness. And there were snipers, and there was machine gun fire, and so forth. Make sure I'm talking. Yeah. Okay, here we go. I was making sure I'm talking about the right carol. So here's an account that was written by a Lieutenant Edward Hulse. It had been pouring, and mud lay deep in the trenches. They were caked from head to foot, and I have never seen anything like their rifles. Not one would work, and they were just lying about the trenches getting stiff and cold. One fellow had got both feet jammed in the clay, and when told to get up by an officer, had to get on all fours. He then got his hands stuck in too and was caught like a fly on flypaper. All he could do was look around and say to his pals, "For God's sake, shoot me." I laughed till I cried. But they will shake down directly they learn that the harder one works in the trenches, the drier and more comfortable one can keep both them and oneself. Awful conditions. On December 17th, 1914, this was the first Christmas of this war. The Pope Benedict XV, called for a temporary truce and a ceasefire on the battlefields. Germany agreed to the ceasefire, but the other powers did not. The war had been going on for 5 months. Families had sent packages filled with cigarettes, warm clothes, gifts, and medicines to the soldiers on the front lines. Some of the German soldiers had also received Christmas decorations from loved ones. Remember, the Christmas tree has its origin in Germany. On Christmas Eve, 1914, the German soldiers put candles in Christmas trees in the trenches and decorated the edges of the trenches. Think about that. Eventually, hundreds of Christmas trees appeared all across the front line for hundreds of miles. British soldiers were told to watch closely but not to open fire. Here's another report. Time and again during the course of that day, the eve of Christmas, there were wafted towards us from the trenches opposite the sounds of singing and merrymaking, and occasionally the guttural tones of a German were heard to be shouting out lustily, "A happy Christmas to you Englishmen." In other places along the front lines, the two sides exchanged Christmas carols. A British soldier named Private Oswald Tilley wrote a letter to his parents that said this: "They finished their carol, and we thought that we ought to retaliate in some way, so we sang the first Noel. And when we finished that, they all began clapping, and then they struck up another favorite of theirs, O Tannenbaum. And so it went on. First the Germans would sing one of their carols, and then we would sing one of ours, until when we started up, O Come All Ye Faithful, the Germans immediately joined in singing the same hymn to the Latin words, Adeste Fidelis. And I thought, well, this was really a most extraordinary thing, two nations both singing the same carol in the middle of the war." And his letter to his parents went on to say this: "This experience has been the most practical demonstration I have seen of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Even with the German soldiers, we hated their guts when they killed any of our friends. Then we really did dislike them intensely. And we thought, well, poor so-and-sos, they're in the same kind of muck as we are. It doesn't seem right to be killing each other at Christmas time." The singing from the trenches eventually turned into something different as soldiers began disobeying their superior officers and fraternized with the enemy across 2/3 of the Western Front. So the Western Front was 450 miles of trenches. And 2/3 of it, you had soldiers up out of the trenches on Christmas Day, fraternizing with the enemy across the line. Thousands of troops streamed across the no man's land between them, where what they had to do to get there was to walk across the rotting corpses of their comrades who had been shot down. They continued singing carols. They exchanged photographs of loved ones back home. They shared their rations. They played football. They even roasted some pigs. Soldiers embraced the men they had been trying to kill and agreed to warn each other if their superior officers forced them to fire their weapons, that they would aim high this time. There's a book called The Christmas Truce, where Corporal John Ferguson is quoted with this story. "We shook hands, we wished each other a Merry Christmas, and were soon conversing as if we had known each other for years. We were in front of their wire entanglements and surrounded by Germans. Fritz and I in the center talking, and Fritz occasionally translating to his friends what I was saying. We stood inside the circle like street corner orators. Soon most of our company, A company, hearing that I and some others had gone out, followed us. What a sight! Little groups of Germans and British extending almost the length of our front. Out of the darkness, we could hear laughter and see lighted matches, a German lighting a Scotchman's cigarette and vice versa, exchanging cigarettes and souvenirs. Where they couldn't talk the language, they were making themselves understood by signs, and everyone seemed to be getting on nicely. Here we were laughing and chatting to men who only a few hours before we were trying to kill." And it began with, "O come all ye faithful," in Latin. Well, when news of this reached the high command, it was decided this couldn't stand. This was not good. And so the legend says that if the soldiers stopped fighting to play football, they would have to return to battle the next day. But this actually was not the case. The soldiers declared their solidarity and refused to fight. And on both sides, generals declared the spontaneous peacemaking as treasonous and subject to court-martial. It took until March 1915 to fully suppress the fraternization that broke out on Christmas Day. 3 months of this. By the time of the armistice in 1918, though, 15 million people had been killed in that battle in World War I. 15 million.
That's
15 million. Yeah. And there are actually some early photographs from this. I've got a couple here in the book I'm reading that show this. Singing Adeste Fidelis is "O come, all ye faithful." O come, all you faithful. Now, it's interesting. There's another story behind this carol, though, in its origin. And I've got to get to another book real quick to get to this. And this also has to do with British history. Let me get to the right page here. O Come All You Faithful has its roots in the Reformation. And you may recall that after the Reformation in England, Catholics were sort of not in favor, and they were banned. Many of them went elsewhere in continental Europe. And one of these exiles was a guy named John Francis Wade, who was a musician and the son of a cloth merchant who was from Leeds, who was caught up in this anti-Catholic sentiment in the decades following the Revolution of 1688. And he fled to France around 1731 when he was age 20. He first went to Flanders and then was at the Benedictine Abbey in Douai, which is near Paris. I didn't pronounce that well, sorry. He found this Latin hymn, Adeste Fidelis, during this time. So the text, the Latin text, is older, much older than this. And he began writing it out in a collection of devotional music that was intended for a Catholic audience in this time. And this he sort of made this popular again. In 1781, this was published in England in a publication called an essay or instruction for learning the church plain chant. So it was part of this idea. And then 10 years later, someone else made an arrangement of the tune and published it in a collection of motets as well. All of these things were explicitly Catholic in their context. The guy who led the music to it, his name was Webb, was a really important figure in the rebirth of Catholic music in England, which had to be limited to private chapels, such as the one attached to the Portuguese embassy in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where he was the organist. So because Catholicism was outlawed in England after the Reformation, right, those who practiced Christianity as Catholics had to do so in private. And this is where this goes. In 1795, the Duke of Leeds attended a service in one of these private services and heard Adeste Fidelis. He liked it so much that he commissioned another arrangement from a different composer of this, who was the organist at Westminster Abbey, and later was confidant of Bonnie Prince Charles. And this became part of his upcoming concert along the way. We don't really know where the text originally came from. We know how it got picked up and how it was used. It seems to have some origins in its music, possibly with an opera along the way. A lot of history that you can look into this. The main thing that we discover when you go digging into the history of it is in early iterations of this, the earliest known copy of this hymn contains a prayer for the king with music immediately before Adeste Fidelis. Now, this was controversial, but this particular prayer was for King James. Catholics never recognized the overthrow of James II. To him, he remained the lawful king of England, and when he died in 1701, he was succeeded by his son, James Francis Edward, and this prayer is for him. So if you know anything about the Jacobite Rebellion, has anyone watched Outlander?
Yes.
Okay, it's all about the Jacobite Rebellion, right, in Scotland and all that. This hymn, this carol, was used to whip up Jacobite rebellion, the Jacobite Rebellion. "O come all ye faithful" is a call to arms for the faithful Catholics. It's code, right? It is intended to appeal to English Catholics to support Bonnie Prince Charles in his insurrection. The faithful are Catholics, come to Bethlehem, that's the true church in captivity, equivalent to Jerusalem. The Latin, natum videte regem angelorum, is a pun. Christ was born king of the angels, but Charles Edward Stuart was born king of the English. Come and behold him. And then the instruction was added for the use of English choirs to some of the surviving signed copies, confirming that these were intended for England, but also to sort of make a pun to readers who would get it. Anyhow, if it was a coded invitation of rebellion, which some scholars think it was, it didn't work. Right? It didn't work. It didn't work on two fronts. The rebellion didn't succeed, but also it didn't work because the carol became so popular it was picked up by the Protestants.
So it didn't work either.
It didn't work on any front with
Oh,
this,
no.
right? It didn't work at all. There is some connection here to a French Noel, which was a series of writings, and there's a lot we could do about that. But it does give us, one of the reasons the hymn is so popular, the carol is so popular, is because it has universal appeal, right? It really has stood the test of time to us. It's something we sing every Christmas Eve here at Wilshire. It's one of the most popular Christmas carols in the world. Sing, choirs of angels, sing in exultation, sing, all ye citizens of heaven above. Glory to God in the highest. Yea, Lord, we greet thee, born this happy morning. Jesus, to thee be glory given. Word of the Father, now in flesh appearing. O come, let us adore him. Interesting double historical connection to this one carol. And yet, we find meaning in it today, even without knowing that part of the story. Isn't that remarkable? What are your thoughts on this? Yes, Helen.
Was the phrase, "Oh, come let us adore him," in the original referring to Charles Edward
I
Stuart?
don't know the answer to that. I don't know whether it was just adapted or whether, and not everyone believes the secret code theory. Yeah, but it sort of lines up,
There were a lot of secret codes.
right? It sort of lines up. Yeah, interesting. What else?
Meant for one thing and completely adapted and adopted for something.
Yeah, so it probably had its origins way before any of this in a Latin version, but was picked up and used by the Jacobites to send a message. But that didn't work because it was so popular, it got picked up by the Protestants anyway. It's like the enemy taking up your secret code and making it their national anthem.
Flies in the face of, yeah.
Right?
I think
Yeah.
we should make all wars fought by sing-offs.
Fought by sing-offs. That would level the playing field, yeah. Perhaps. Okay, and then, the other part of that is then it gets brought up later in American history. Oh, wait, I closed the wrong book. I'm pulling from 3 different books today with these stories. I want to end today with O Little Town of Bethlehem. Anyone know the name Phillips Brooks? important figure. If you go to Trinity Church in Boston, anyone ever been to Trinity Church in Boston? Beautiful, beautiful place. There is a life-size statue of him there. Have you seen it?
Yes.
The statue. Yeah. He was born in Massachusetts in 1836, and to give consolation to all of us who think we've been a failure at some point, he was fired from his first job. Then he was ordained as a parish priest in 1860 and became one of the most imposing figures in New England on the religious scene. He was named Bishop of Massachusetts in 1891. And when he died, just a year after that, the city of Boston was reported to have buried him like a king. A great man had fallen in Israel. He was such an influential figure there. He wrote the words to O Little Town of Bethlehem. The tune is an old English folk song. And the idea of putting these two together goes to a very, very famous English composer, Ralph Vaughan Williams, who was committed to musical history and the traditions of his country, and he's the one who married these two things along the way. Phillips Brooks was 6'4", he was an imposing figure, and he could write beautifully. He gave a funeral oration for Abraham Lincoln, delivered yards from where Lincoln's body lay in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Just a sample of his speaking. One brave, reckless man came forth to cast himself almost single-handed with a hopeless hope against the proud power that he hated, and trust to the influence of a soul marching on into the history of his countrymen to stir them to a vindication of the truth he loved. So forth and so on. Below the sad melody that had been shaped for bondage, slavery will not die. While one man counts another man who's born inferior for the color of his skin, so let him lie here in our midst today, this best and most American of all Americans. May God make us worthy of the memory of Abraham Lincoln. This was great oratory in his time. Phillips Brooks was really committed to congregational singing. And this was an era in which parish pastors were often involved in the writing of hymns, and he wrote several. Shortly after Lincoln's death, Phillips Brooks visited the Holy Land. And the scene he found there moved him deeply and reminded him of the Civil War at home. Here's what he said. I remember standing in the old church in Bethlehem, close to the spot where Jesus was born, when the whole church was ringing hour after hour with splendid hymns of praise to God. How again and again it seemed as if I could hear voices I knew well, telling each other of the wonderful night of the Savior's birth. Forever and ever there will be a singing in my soul. Back home in Philadelphia, he wrote the lyrics. He was not in Boston yet, he was in Philadelphia. He wrote the lyrics, O Little Town of Bethlehem, as a reminder of that visit to Bethlehem. And his organist at the church set them to music. As so often happens, Phillips Brooks had given him, the organist, the text and said, would you set this to music, like earlier in the year? And he didn't. He procrastinated. And then it was time to sing it on Christmas Eve. He hadn't written a tune. And he had a dream on Christmas Eve, 1868, wrote out the tune that morning. This would have been Christmas Day of 1868. And it was sung for the very first time in 1868. That tune, called St. Louis, is the one most often used in the United States. There is a different tune that this is sung to in Europe that was put to it by Vaughan Williams as well. So that tune is Forest Green. So here's how that would go. O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. We know this tune, we sing other things to it. That's what Ray Vaughan Williams wanted Phillips Brooks' tune sung to. But of course, O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee. That's the American version of it, written by Phillips Brooks' organist on Christmas Eve and premiered the next day on Christmas Day. O morning stars together proclaim the holy birth, and praises sing to God the King, and peace to men on earth. For Christ is born of Mary and gathered all above. While mortals sleep, the angels keep their watch of wondering love. How silently this wondrous gift is given. So God imparts to human hearts the blessings of his heaven. No ear may hear his coming, but in this world of sin, where meek souls will receive him still, the dear Christ enters in. Beautiful. O holy child of Bethlehem, descend to us, we pray. Cast out our sin and enter in. Be born in us today. We hear the Christmas angels the great glad tidings tell. O come to us, abide with us, our Lord Emmanuel. Amen. In the sermon today, pay attention if you've not already heard it, George tells the story about visiting Nativity Square, which is the very place where Phillips Brooks was inspired to write this hymn. And one of the most important things about that visit, some of you have been there, right? Catherine, you've been there? Yeah, Nikki? What do you have to do to get in?
You have to bend down to go through this little tiny hole.
It's called the door of humility.
Well,
Everyone who enters has to humble themselves. Jim?
Let me tell you an interesting story by George Buttrick about Phillips Brooks. He was the preacher of all preachers in Boston for many, many years, a distinguished. Everybody knew him. And every morning he would take a walk down a certain street. Well, the houses and the apartments or whatever were just right up flush to the street and had a little porch. And so he was walking along one day and people were saying, "Psst, there goes Phillips Brooks." And he walked along and happened to spot a little boy on a porch. And they had those bells that weren't like ours, but you push it and it would make a sound inside.
Yeah.
And this little boy was reaching, trying to ring the doorbell. And in a moment of compassion, Phillips Brooks raced up onto the porch and looked down on the little boy and pushed the button or whatever. And then he looked at the little boy and said, "What now?" And the little boy said, "Let's run like hell." Listen, there is a wonderful prayer. I don't know how to find it, but it was written by Phillips Brooks, and it is amazing in the way it applies to you and me and all of us in today's life.
I'll see if I can find it and send it to everyone.
It's wonderful. You know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
yeah. Helen?
I never hear a little town of Bethlehem without thinking about a song on a Christmas album I have by the Gatlins. And to paraphrase, it says, "No peace tonight in Bethlehem. Two sons of Abraham have squared off across a line in the sand." And it's really moving, really moving.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna have to draw us to a close here and say goodbye to our live streamers. Live streamers, we will not be meeting next week. Join us for worship at 10 o'clock online. Carol Ann sent me a note this morning saying that We're so glad that you joined us in Discovery class via live stream today, and we hope that you'll join us every Sunday when you're available. If it's possible for you to join us in person, we would love to meet you as well. We meet every Sunday morning about 9:45, 9:50 in the parlor at Wilshire Baptist Church, 4316 Abrams Road here in Dallas. If you'd like to know more about Wilshire, visit our website at wilshirebc.org, or also check out our YouTube channel at Wilshire BC on YouTube.